The massive research ship, Stellar Unity, shook violently as sparks flew from broken control panels throughout its corridors. Deep in the Arcturus Nebula, far from any help, the vessel was dying piece by piece. Senior engineer Kim Tae-ho ran through the chaos, his boots pounding against metal floors that groaned with each impact. Around him, panic filled every corner of the ship. The six-limbed Quellan aliens scratched desperately at their control stations, their sharp claws making awful scraping sounds against the metal. Their normally organized movements had turned frantic and wild. The phaselings, usually glowing with steady blue light, now flickered like broken street lamps. Their bodies, made of pure energy, pulsed between bright and dim as fear took hold of them. The massive Rockins stomped their heavy feet, each step shaking the floor. These stone-like beings, normally calm and steady, now moved with the urgent panic of creatures who knew death was coming. Primary life support systems now operating at 40% capacity, the ship's computer announced in its cold, emotionless voice. The words echoed through the corridors, just as another explosion, somewhere deep in the ship, sent everyone stumbling. Emergency lights bathed everything in red, making the alien faces look even more frightening. The explosion came from the engineering deck, where Tae-ho knew the heart of their problems lay. Black smoke poured from ventilation shafts, carrying the bitter smell of burning circuits and melted plastic. The air itself felt wrong, too thin and too warm, as the life support systems struggled to keep everyone breathing. On the bridge, the alien crew stood in perfect formation, just like their training manuals told them to do. First Officer Yeldar, a tall Quellan with silver markings across his exoskeleton, held a glowing data pad in 2 of his 6 hands. His other 4 hands moved in precise patterns as he read through emergency procedures word by word. According to Regulation 7-4 Alpha, Yeldar announced in his clicking voice, "We must prepare evacuation pods and transmit distress signals on all frequencies." Captain Morthek, a massive Rockin whose body looked like it was carved from granite, nodded slowly. His voice rumbled like distant thunder when he spoke. "How long until rescue arrives under standard protocols?" "Minimum response time is 37 standard days," replied the ship's navigation officer. "However, given our location in the nebula, it could be up to 90 days. What none of them said out loud was the truth that hung heavy in the air like the acrid smoke. 90 days was impossible. At 40% life support and falling, they had maybe 10 days before the air became unbreathable. The ship's systems were failing faster than they could be fixed using normal methods. But Kim Tae-ho wasn't listening to their careful discussions about proper procedures and regulation manuals. While the aliens followed their training, consulting rulebooks and emergency protocols that assumed help would always come, the human engineer saw something different. His dark eyes moved quickly over the damaged control panels, the sparking wires and the failing systems around him. Where the aliens saw catastrophic failure, Tae-ho saw raw materials. Where they saw broken equipment that needed to be replaced, he saw components that could be moved, combined, and used in completely new ways. His mind raced through possibilities that no engineering textbook had ever described. He grabbed his worn toolkit, the metal box covered in scratches and dents from years of hard use. Inside were not just the standard repair tools, but strange items he had collected over the years. Pieces of wire from a dozen different worlds, adapters that could connect incompatible systems, and small devices he had built himself for jobs that required thinking outside normal rules. The aliens were still debating procedure when Tae-ho headed toward the damaged sections of the ship. His footsteps echoed differently now, not with panic like the others, but with purpose. Each step took him deeper into the dangerous areas where normal safety protocols said no one should go. As he walked, he could hear the ship dying around him. Systems that had worked perfectly for years now made grinding, whining sounds. The lights flickered more frequently, and the air recyclers coughed and wheezed like sick animals. But instead of filling him with despair, these sounds told him a story of opportunities waiting to be discovered. Chief Science Officer Vexara's crystalline body turned bright orange with alarm as she watched Kim Tae-ho pull apart what looked like perfectly good equipment. Her forearms waved frantically as sparks flew from the atmospheric recycler he was dismantling with his plasma torch. "Stop this madness immediately," she shrieked, her voice making a sound like breaking glass. "Those recyclers are absolutely critical for our survival. Without them, we will all suffocate within hours." Tejo didn't even look up from his work. Sweat dripped down his face as he carefully removed a complex filtration unit from the recycler's core. "I'm not breaking it," he said calmly, setting the component aside with gentle hands. "I'm just moving the important parts to where they'll do more good." The alien science officer stared in horror as he began rerouting thick coolant lines that were supposed to carry liquid through the ship's main systems. Instead of following the original pathways that engineers had designed years ago, Tejo connected them directly to the waste processing system. The idea was so crazy that Vexara's body flashed between orange and purple, colors that showed complete confusion. "That system processes organic waste," she protested. "It was never designed to handle coolant flow. The contamination alone could poison our entire water supply." "Only if we use it the old way," Tejo replied, his hands already working to install new filters he was building from spare parts. "But we're not doing anything the old way anymore." While Vexara watched in growing amazement, Tejo began one of the most ambitious modifications anyone had ever attempted on a working starship. He took the powerful gravity generators from the ship's gymnasium, machines designed to create artificial gravity for exercise and recreation, and began converting them into emergency power boosters. The work required him to crawl through narrow, maintenance tunnels, dragging heavy equipment through spaces barely wide enough for his shoulders. The gymnasium had been a beautiful space just hours before, with polished floors and equipment for dozens of different alien species to exercise. Now it looked like a war zone, with floor panels torn up and machinery scattered everywhere. But from the chaos, something new was emerging. Navigation Officer Park So-jin arrived just as Tejo was welding together two pieces of equipment that had never been designed to work together. She was one of the few other humans on the ship, and unlike the aliens, she understood immediately what he was trying to do. But understanding didn't make it any less terrifying to watch. "Tejo," she said quietly, "are you really connecting the gravity generator's power output directly to the main electrical grid, without any safety buffers or regulation systems?" He nodded, not stopping his work even as dangerous-looking electrical arcs danced around his welding torch. "The safety systems are luxury we can't afford right now. We need every bit of power we can get, and we need it flowing to where it matters most." So-jin watched as he worked with tools that were never meant to be used this way, creating connections that violated every safety protocol she had ever learned. The smell of hot metal and burning insulation filled the air, but somehow, incredibly, the jury-rigged power booster began to hum with life. But Tejo's most ambitious project was yet to come. He led a small group of volunteers to the ship's musical performance hall, a grand space with perfect acoustics where different alien species had once shared their cultural arts. The hall's advanced sound systems, designed to carry music to every corner of the large room, were incredibly sophisticated pieces of technology. "Music systems?" asked Ensign Kraltok, a young Rockan whose stone-like face showed complete bewilderment. "How can entertainment equipment help us survive?" Tejo smiled as he began dismantling the acoustic processors. "Sound is just vibration, and vibration can move air. These systems were built to control sound waves with incredible precision. With some modifications, they can control airflow just as precisely." Working through the night, he transformed the performance hall into something that had never existed before. Using the sound equipment's sophisticated wave generation technology, he created a backup life support system that could process air, regulate temperature, and even purify water using nothing but vibration and frequency manipulation. The aliens gathered to watch as he powered up his impossible creation. The hall filled with a low humming sound, barely audible but somehow felt throughout their bodies. Then, miraculously, fresh, clean air began flowing through vents he had installed using repurposed instrument components. "This shouldn't work," So-jin whispered, her voice filled with awe as she tested the air quality with her scanner. The readings showed perfectly breathable atmosphere, exactly what they needed to survive. Tejo wiped his hands on his work clothes and looked at his creation with satisfaction. Shouldn't work and won't work are two completely different things, he said with a tired grin. The universe doesn't care about our rule books. Physics works the same way whether we follow procedures or not. Already his mind was racing toward the next impossible modification, the next problem that everyone else would call unsolvable. With the ship's immediate death avoided, Kim Tae-ho realized that keeping everyone alive meant more than just his own crazy repairs. He needed to teach the alien crew to think like humans, to see solutions where their training told them only problems existed. But changing the way an entire species approached problem-solving was going to be harder than rewiring a broken starship. Engineer. Klaxon was Tae-ho's first real challenge. The Quellan stood nearly 7 feet tall, with 6 arms that moved in perfectly coordinated patterns. Every action Klaxon took was precise, calculated, and followed exact procedures that his people had used for thousands of years. When something broke, Klaxon would consult his datapad, find the correct replacement part, and install it exactly according to the manual. The navigation array requires a Markarian 7 processing unit, Klaxon announced, his metallic voice, carrying no emotion. Without this specific component, repair is impossible. We must wait for rescue and proper parts. Tae-ho looked at the damaged navigation system and saw something completely different. Where Klaxon saw the need for one specific expensive part, the human engineer saw a dozen different ways to make the system work, using things they already had on the ship. What if we don't use a Markarian 7? Tae-ho asked, pulling out 3 smaller processing units from completely different systems. What if we wire these together to do the same job? Klaxon's exoskeleton clicked nervously. That is not proper procedure. These units are not designed to work together. The specifications clearly state. Forget the specifications for a minute, Tae-ho interrupted gently. Your species thinks in straight lines. Problem leads to solution, cause leads to effect, everything neat and organized. But sometimes you need to think in spirals. Go around the problem, come at it from directions nobody expects. Working side by side, Tae-ho showed Klaxon how to connect the 3 smaller units using wire from the ship's communication system and circuits borrowed from a broken coffee maker. The Quellan's hands shook as he made connections that his training said were impossible, but slowly, incredibly, the navigation array began to respond. It works, Klaxon whispered, his voice filled with something that sounded almost like wonder. But how? The mathematical probability of success should have been nearly 0. Probability doesn't matter when you're desperate enough, Tae-ho replied with a grin. Sometimes the universe surprises you. The energy-based phaselings presented a different challenge entirely. These beings existed as pure light and electrical energy, normally interacting with the physical world through specially designed interface suits. Their leader, senior technician Fluxara, had never directly touched solid matter in her entire existence. We cannot manipulate physical components, she explained, her glowing form flickering with uncertainty. Our people have always worked through technological interfaces. Direct contact with solid matter is uncomfortable for us. But Tae-ho had watched how the phaselings' energy forms naturally affected electronic equipment around them. When they moved near control panels, lights would flicker and systems would respond in subtle ways. He realized they had capabilities they didn't even know about. You don't need to touch things the way I do, he explained patiently. But you can influence them. Watch this broken power coupling. Don't try to fix it mechanically. Instead, try to understand the electrical flow running through it. Under his guidance, Fluxara began to sense the patterns of electricity moving through damaged circuits. Slowly, carefully, she learned to adjust those patterns with her own energy field. Within hours, she was repairing electrical problems that would have taken conventional tools days to fix. I can feel the electricity like a river, she said in amazement. I never knew we could do this. The tradition-bound Rakan were perhaps the most difficult to convince. These massive, stone-like beings had used the same engineering methods for over 10,000 years. Their approach to problems was methodical, conservative, and absolutely resistant to change. Junior engineer Mordak spoke for many of his people when he said, "We do not experiment. We do not take risks. We follow procedures that have kept our people safe for millennia. But Communications Officer Li Ji-woo, the other human on the engineering team, found a way to reach them. She began translating Taeho's chaotic, intuitive methods into the mathematical formulas and logical progressions that the different alien species could understand. Look, she explained to a group of skeptical Rakan, Taeho's approach isn't really random. There's mathematical logic behind it. He's calculating probability matrices in his head, testing multiple solution paths simultaneously, and optimizing for available resources rather than ideal resources. By putting human intuition into alien mathematical language, Ji-woo helped bridge the gap between human creativity and alien logic. The breakthrough moment came when junior engineer Zephyrus, a young Rakan who had been quietly watching everything, decided to try something completely unprecedented for his species. The ship's secondary thrusters had failed, leaving them unable to maneuver properly. According to standard procedure, this required specialized thruster components that they didn't have. But Zephyrus had been watching Taeho work, and something had changed in the way he thought about problems. Instead of waiting for proper parts, Zephyrus went to the ship's kitchen and began collecting equipment that had nothing to do with space travel. He took pressure cookers, industrial-strength fans from the food preservation system, and even fabric from the dining hall's tablecloths. Working through the night, he built something that no engineering manual would ever describe. When he powered up his creation, it actually worked. The makeshift thruster provided just enough directional control to keep the ship stable in the nebula's dangerous currents. "I improvised," Zephyrus announced to the gathered crowd, his stone-like face showing an expression that might have been pride mixed with complete bewilderment. He spoke the word improvised, like someone discovering a new sense they never knew they possessed. The change rippled through the crew. Aliens who had spent their entire lives following rules began to question those rules. They started seeing opportunities instead of obstacles, possibilities instead of limitations. The ship's sensors began screaming warnings 3 hours before anyone could see the danger with their own eyes. Deep in the Arcturus Nebula, a massive electromagnetic storm was building, the kind of cosmic fury that could tear apart entire fleets of warships. The readings on the display screen showed energy levels that made even the experienced crew members step back in fear. Kim Taeho stared at the sensor data, his face growing pale as he realized what they were facing. This wasn't just any storm. The electromagnetic pulse would be strong enough to fry every circuit on the ship, turning all of his carefully jury-rigged systems into useless scrap metal. Everything they had built, every impossible repair that had kept them alive, would be destroyed in seconds. "Conventional shielding protocols are impossible," announced Science Officer Vexera, her crystalline body flashing deep red with alarm. "Our electromagnetic barriers were damaged in the original cascade failure. We have no protection against a storm of this magnitude." The bridge fell silent as the full weight of their situation settled on everyone. Captain Morthek's massive stone form seemed to shrink as he contemplated their options. "How long until the storm reaches us?" 2 hours and 37 minutes, replied the navigation officer, his voice barely above a whisper. But while the aliens began discussing evacuation procedures and emergency protocols that everyone knew were hopeless, Taeho's mind was racing in completely different directions. He wasn't thinking about protection from the storm. He was thinking about becoming part of it. "What if we don't try to block the electromagnetic energy?" he said suddenly, causing every head to turn toward him. "What if we guide it instead?" The idea that formed in his mind was so dangerous, so completely against every safety regulation ever written, that even he hesitated to speak it out loud. But with death approaching fast, conventional wisdom had become a luxury they couldn't afford. "We turn the entire ship into a conductor," he announced, his voice growing stronger as the plan crystallized in his thoughts. "We use hull fragments, spare wiring, anything conductive we can find. Instead of letting the electromagnetic energy hit us randomly and destroy everything, we create pathways for it to flow through harmlessly." Engineer Klaxon's 6 arms began moving in agitated patterns. "That is absolutely insane." You want to deliberately channel deadly electromagnetic energy through our ship? The risk of electrocution alone would be enormous. The risk of doing nothing is certain death, Tejo replied grimly. This way we at least have a chance. Captain Morthek studied the human engineer with eyes that had seen thousands of years of careful, conservative decision-making. But everything about this situation was beyond anything his experience had prepared him for. Finally, his voice rumbled through the bridge like distant thunder. "This will require everyone," he announced, and in those 4 words the alien captain showed that he finally understood what human survival really meant. It wasn't about following rules or waiting for rescue. It was about the willingness to attempt the impossible when the alternative was giving up. What followed was the most frantic construction project in the ship's history. Every crew member, regardless of their normal duties or physical limitations, threw themselves into the desperate work. They had less than 2 hours to completely rewire their ship's exterior, creating conductive pathways that would safely channel electromagnetic energy around their most critical systems. The Quellan crew members suffered the most. Their chitinous exoskeletons, designed for precision work in comfortable environments, scraped and cracked as they crawled through maintenance tunnels barely wide enough for their bodies. Klaxon emerged from one particularly narrow passage with green fluid seeping from cracks in his shell, but he immediately grabbed more wiring and headed for the next connection point. The phaselings faced their own agony. These energy-based beings had to compress their naturally flowing forms into dense, almost solid shapes to fit into the ship's mechanical spaces. The process was incredibly painful for them, like forcing a gas to become liquid through pure willpower. But Senior Technician Fluxara led by example, squeezing herself into spaces where her energy form could directly interface with the electrical systems they were creating. Most surprising of all were the Rockin, whose species had never moved quickly in their entire evolutionary history. These massive, stone-like beings suddenly found themselves racing against time, their heavy feet pounding through corridors as they carried massive sections of hull plating and heavy wiring. Junior engineer Zephyrus, still flush with pride from his earlier improvisation success, worked so fast that sparks flew from his stone fingers as he welded connections. Communications Officer Lee Jiwoo coordinated the entire effort, her voice echoing through the ship's communication system as she guided different teams to their positions. Team 3, we need more conductive mesh on Deck 7. Team 5, reroute those power cables away from the life support systems. As the storm grew closer, the ship began to shake with electromagnetic interference. Lights flickered throughout. The corridors and sensitive equipment started showing erratic readings. Through the observation windows they could see the nebula itself beginning to glow with dangerous energy. With only minutes remaining, Tejo made his final connections to the ship's main power grid. His hands shook slightly as he realized that one mistake, one miscalculation, could electrocute the entire crew instantly. The network of jury-rigged conductors, salvaged components, and recycled systems looked like the work of someone who had completely lost their mind. Then the storm hit them. The electromagnetic pulse struck the ship like an invisible hammer, sending energy levels soaring beyond anything the sensors could measure. Every light on the ship blazed with impossible brightness before dimming to almost nothing. The air itself seemed to crackle with electricity, and a low humming sound filled every corridor. Tejo held his breath as sparks flew from dozens of his makeshift connections. The entire ship groaned under the assault, metal creaking and wiring smoking as electromagnetic energy flowed through pathways that had never been designed to carry such power. But incredibly, impossibly, it held. The storm raged around them for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it finally passed, the ship was still intact, still alive, still breathing. Tejo's impossible network of scavenged parts and desperate modifications had guided the deadly energy safely around their most critical systems. In the silence that followed, everyone realized they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for generations, the moment when human ingenuity and alien determination had defeated the cosmos itself. 5 months after the electromagnetic storm nearly destroyed them, the rescue fleet that found the stellar Unity couldn't believe what they were seeing. The ship floating in space before them looked like nothing in any database or technical manual. Where sleek hull plating should have been, they saw a patchwork of different metals welded together in patterns that seemed to follow no logical design. Strange protrusions jutted out at odd angles, and what appeared to be kitchen equipment had been somehow integrated into the ship's external structure. "Are you certain this is the research vessel, Stellar Unity?" asked Admiral Corthan, commander of the rescue fleet. His voice carried the confusion of someone staring at something that shouldn't exist. "Our records show a standard Galactic Council research configuration, but this looks like it was built by scavengers." Captain Morthek's reply came through the communication system with what sounded almost like pride. "This is indeed the Stellar Unity, Admiral. We have been modified." When the rescue teams finally boarded the ship, they found something even more extraordinary than the external changes. The interior had been completely transformed into something that no engineer had ever imagined. Systems that should have been separate were connected in impossible ways. The ship's dining hall had become a secondary engine room. The library now housed water purification equipment built from musical instruments. The gymnasium had been converted into a power generation facility that hummed with energy from sources the rescue teams couldn't even identify. But most remarkable of all were the crew members themselves. The aliens who had once followed rigid procedures and consulted rulebooks for every decision now moved with the confident improvisation that had once been uniquely human. They fixed problems with whatever materials were available, created solutions from seemingly random components, and approached each new challenge with the assumption that there had to be a way to make it work. Former Chief Science Officer Vexara had changed the most dramatically. Where once she had been rigid and rule-bound, now she moved through the ship with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered an entirely new way of thinking. She had requested reassignment from her original position to become the galaxy's first Professor of Adaptive Engineering, a field that hadn't existed before the Stellar Unity's ordeal. "The human Kim Tae-ho taught us something that changed everything we thought we knew about problem-solving," she explained to the fascinated rescue team members. "We learned to think like humans. Not just to find solutions to problems, but to completely refuse to accept that any problem cannot be solved." Her crystalline body glowed with excitement as she showed them through the ship's modifications. "Look at this atmospheric processor," she said, pointing to a device that appeared to be made from spare clothing, kitchen utensils, and parts from the ship's entertainment system. According to every engineering principle we knew, this combination of components should not work, but it has been providing perfect air quality for months. Engineer Klaxon, who had once insisted that every repair follow exact specifications, now spoke like a completely different person. "We learned that the universe does not care about our manuals and procedures," he explained, his 6 arms moving in patterns that seemed more fluid and creative than the rigid motions he had used before. "Physics works the same way whether we follow the rules or not. The only question is whether we are clever enough to find solutions that work." The rescue teams documented everything they found, but even their detailed reports couldn't capture the most important change that had occurred. The crew of the Stellar Unity had learned to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. They had developed what the reports would eventually call adaptive thinking, the ability to approach any problem with the assumption that a solution existed, even if it had never been tried before. Communications Officer Lee Ji-woo had become something like a translator between human intuition and alien logic. She had spent months developing mathematical models that explained why Tae-ho's seemingly random modifications actually worked. Her equations showed that human improvisation wasn't really random at all. It was a form of rapid problem-solving that tested multiple solution paths simultaneously. "Humans don't just think outside the box," she explained to a gathering of engineers from across the galaxy. "They refuse to acknowledge that the box exists in the first place. They see the universe as a collection of resources and possibilities, not as a set of limitations and restrictions." The story of the Stellar Unity spread throughout the galaxy faster than the rescue ships that carried the crew home. Engineering. Schools began teaching courses in human-style problem-solving. Emergency response teams started carrying kits of seemingly random components that could be combined in unexpected ways. The rigid adherence to procedure that had dominated galactic engineering for thousands of years began to give way to something more flexible and creative. Junior engineer Zephyrus, the young Rockin, who had first learned to improvise by building a thruster from kitchen equipment, became a celebrity throughout Rockin space. His people, traditionally the most conservative engineers in the galaxy, began sending their brightest students to study human methods. The young stone singer has shown us that our ancestors' ways, while honorable, are not the only ways, declared the Rockin Engineering Council. But perhaps the most important change was in how the galaxy approached the concept of impossible problems. Before the stellar unity, when engineers encountered a situation with no obvious solution, they would typically wait for better resources or accept failure. Now they had learned to ask a different question. What would a human do? Kim Tae-ho's desperate modifications during those months of isolation had become the foundation for an entirely new approach to engineering that spread from world to world. Technical colleges throughout the galaxy began teaching Tae-ho protocols, emergency procedures based on the principle that any problem could be solved using available resources and sufficient creativity. The human way of engineering, with its stubborn refusal to accept defeat and its willingness to attempt the impossible, had transformed not just one dying ship, but an entire galaxy's approach to survival. And it all started with one human engineer who refused to give up when giving up was the logical thing to do.